Hello and welcome to our Freed Indeed special tonight with Loryn Jenkins. I'm your host, Kevin J. N. Hughes, and this is probably the discussion that I've been most excited for that we were going to have, which is on the people of Israel and the church as the Israel of God. So before we get into it, Loryn, how have you been doing?
I've been really good, thank you, Kevin. Just recently, I've been sharing some reminiscences with my wife and my children, because today, as we speak, this is the 10th anniversary of me writing a letter to the Seventh-day Adventist Church Board, of which we were a local member, and advising them that I was resigning membership. So me and my family checked out of Adventism 10 years ago today.
Wow. Congratulations. That's awesome. That's really awesome.
I remember 10 years ago, this day 10 years ago, when we wrote that letter, it was a real sense of foreboding and dread. We couldn't see what was on the other side. And I remember writing the letter, and me, Tammy, my daughter, signed it, and sent it off, hit the button to send it off, and bang. I just remember feeling bleak because it felt like it's cutting myself off from everything I'd always known.
Right.
And Tammy and I stood in the hallway and hugged and cried. But in retrospect, the absolutely best thing we've done, because that gave us the space to explore Christianity without the enveloping culture of Seventh-day Adventism warping everything we see when we read the Bible. So for the next 3 years, I was free to read the Bible without those constraints, and read and discovered a bunch of doctrines that led me directly to the Orthodox Church. And once I arrived at the Orthodox Church, they expanded for me vast vistas of doctrine and experience, of healing, and a knowledge of God that I had never dreamed of. And so when I'm reminiscing with my wife and children, we talk about what a great experience we've had in the last 10 years, in post-Adventism.
Right.
Because leaving Adventism was enough for me to begin to experience real joy, perhaps for the first time, without any other input.
Right.
But, once we arrived at Orthodoxy, the input is voluminous. And I realized that, my own understanding and comprehension was so minuscule.
Right.
And the, vision of God, the reality of a relationship with Him, the healing and the consolation of the soul is so great. I'm really convinced that my children would not be Christians today if we hadn't have left Adventism. And they would not be Christians today if we had not discovered Orthodox Christianity. But for both my children, my daughters, their husbands, and now their children, Orthodox Christianity is an incredibly positive experience for them.
That's really wonderful. I love hearing that. And it's mind-blowing, isn't it, to think that 10 years ago you were sad leaving Adventism, but 10 years down the line, what the Loryn who was sad and in tears in the hallway couldn't imagine is that now 10 years later you look back on that with joy. That's such a powerful reminder of how God works in our lives. But also I think it's a good kind of, for anybody who's on the fence about leaving Adventism right now, I think that is a really excellent testimony to be able to say, that decision seems really hard today, but 5 years, 10 years down the road, you'll be so glad that you made that decision. And so, definitely I would encourage you, and Loryn would encourage you to step off the fence and come visit the Orthodox Church, because that's where God is made manifest.
Yeah, when you first leave Adventism, it's what you're programmed within Adventism to focus on is this binary objective true, objective false. And
right.
It's really easy to focus on in the process of leaving Adventism, to focus on everything that's false. But as I've progressed within Orthodox Christianity, what it's led me to do is not only acknowledge those aspects of Adventism that are false, but probably more importantly, to really connect with those aspects of Adventism that is true, but underdeveloped. And
right.
I mean, one day we might, even if you're up for it, do a special episode where we discuss, how I feel, how you feel, more Adventist today than ever before, because the best aspirations and hopes and dreams of Adventism
right.
are really alive and fulfilled within Orthodox Christianity.
Definitely. I definitely agree with that. And I think, I think that would be a really fun show to do, and definitely a different perspective, because I think that often you're right. People, when they're doing apologetics, whether it's right or wrong, they do get into a mindset of like I'm doing a show about Adventism, so I'm going to poke holes in all the Adventist stuff. And it doesn't have to be that way. There's actually a lot of beauty and a lot of truth that is within the Adventist community. But like you said, it's underdeveloped. You're having to see it kind of through, like when you're looking at a mirror right after you get out of the shower and it's all blurry and there's steam. That's kind of what Adventism is like. There is truth, there is something real there, but it's covered. And really, becoming Orthodox.
St. Paul said something like, just to riff off you,
yeah.
Paul said something like, "We see through a dark glassly."
That's right.
Through a glass darkly, right? With Adventism, it's kind of like we see it through a glass, double glazed, tinted, and misted up from the shower.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what it's like. And
sorry
yeah,
to cut you off there.
no,
I
totally.
saw the opportunity for a bit of a joke.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great joke, and it's a great point. So that's awesome. So congratulations on 10 years of being free. Now, how long have
Freed
you
indeed,
actually
man.
been
Freed
part of the
indeed.
Orthodox Church? That's right, freed indeed. How long have you been Orthodox?
I think it's 7 or 8 years now.
7 or 8 years?
So
Because I know you
I
came
began
into
worshiping.
Orthodoxy pretty fast out of
I began,
Adventism.
yeah, began worshiping at the Good Shepherd in August 2016, and Tammy and I were received via baptism around December 23, 2017.
That's
So
awesome.
depending on where you count, when I started attending versus when we were baptized, somewhere in the zone there is the answer to that question.
All right. Well, that wonderful kind of out there. We then, if you guys haven't been following, I definitely recommend going back and watching the whole series that we've been doing. We have been covering the life of Moses, and in our first episode, we compared the relationship that Moses had to God with the relationship that the people had to God, and we saw that the life of Moses is actually the Christian life, and that what Moses experienced with God is actually what each and every one of us can potentially experience with God. And then we examined the texts related to the law of Sinai, and my mind was actually kind of blown in that episode because I really saw for the first time how much my own understanding of the idea of the Ten Commandments and all these things was flawed. And especially, I was struck by, and I commented in the middle of it that I was struck by how it just made so much more sense of the narrative of Moses's life and how Moses interacts with God and how God interacts with Moses. And there was just so much there that was so eye-opening and powerful for me. And so hopefully for anybody who was watching, it was that way as well. And then we examined whether or not the Torah represents a universal law for all of humanity. And we saw what is kind of the universal law of Christ, and also the law of Moses and how it actually was intended to function. And now in this episode, we're looking at the church as Israel, and we want to examine a little bit more about, well, if the church is Israel, somebody might ask, then why isn't the church required to do everything that was unique to Israel? So we should probably start out by establishing that first claim, which is that the church is, in fact, the people of Israel and the inheritors of the promises of the God of Israel. So, Loryn, when we say that the church is Israel, we don't mean that it's a nation in the Middle East with a little star on its flag. So, what do we mean when we say that?
No, we don't mean that. That's for sure. Yeah, I mean, so I think if you, given that you've introduced the Zionist state and its title, Israel, I think what we've got to say is that, that state is laying claim to a title with great meaning and depth and many promises. And one of the reasons they want to lay claim to that title is because of the promises attached to that identity. And the fact that that identity is being claimed by the church and by the Zionist state. I'm just using that term to disambiguate.
Differentiate. Yeah, absolutely.
Just disambiguate what I'm referring to. The fact that there's a contested identity there is nothing new, because there was a contested identity for the title of Israel in the first century,
right,
when Christianity was forming. And one of the really interesting things in delving into first century Judaism is the various claims, to be Israel. So the Judean state at the time had a series of factions, if you like, different ways of being Judean, different ways of being a Jew. And many of those ways of being a Jew, they claimed the title of Israel because of the promises associated with it. So there was a factions that controlled the temple and saw the temple as the national symbol around which God's blessings would flow. There were factions who didn't control the temple, who argued for holiness and righteousness according to the law of Moses, with the implication being that if only Israel, all of Israel, could keep the covenant for a short time entirely, then God's blessings would flow to them. The Romans, when they had taken over control of Palestine, had dismissed the hereditary priests and had appointed phonies and flunkies to that place that were dependent on Roman rule. And so when in some quarters there was a feeling that the wrong people were priests,
right,
there was actually something real behind that. And the Qumran community claimed to be led by the people who were the real hereditary priests, who really ought to have been in charge of the temple, or at least that's what their propaganda was.
Right.
And so in Qumran, they said, no, it's not the temple that is Israel. It is not the broader community. It is this community at Qumran. We are Israel. But something was wrong, because the return from the exile that was promised was a promise where they would regain national sovereignty, where God's blessing and God's presence would inhabit the temple, and everyone would be free. But instead, the Roman heel was on Judea. It was dominated by the pagan armies who had pagan gods as their totems on each of their centuries. And the wrong people were in charge of the temple. An upstart politician who had been forced to become Jewish at the point of a sword, or at least his parents did, had curried favor with the Romans and had been made king over Israel, even though he wasn't properly Jewish and hadn't spent the requisite number of years converting, and plus that those conversions were always suspicious because they were done at the point of a sword.
Right.
So in the first century, the analysis was quite disturbing, because has the return from exile even happened? Was a real question.
Right.
But of course, when we're saying, all of this is contested, let's just think back to what it is they're contesting for.
Right.
So Jacob was one of the patriarchs from whom flowed the 12 tribes of Israel. He had an encounter with the angel of the Lord, and wrestled and struggled with him. And because of his struggle with the Lord, he was given the spiritual name Israel. As his children were born, and they themselves had children, they, became known as the children of Israel. As the children of Israel, they were constituted into a nation through the Exodus and the Sinai event.
Mm-hmm.
And, they became, known as the tribes of Israel. And then when they established a monarchy under Saul, the nation became known as Israel. And under Saul, David, and Solomon, it was a united kingdom of Israel. And then after Solomon's death, the northern 10 tribes seceded, and at least in the Bible, were attributed the title, the kingdom of Israel, and the, southerly 2 tribes that were centered around Jerusalem were known as the kingdom of Judah. So Israel and Judah, 2 independent kingdoms that were sometimes allied and sometimes at war. The northern kingdom established a religious system to rival what was in the southern kingdom as a way of establishing the hegemony of the kings of the kingdom of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not this divided Israel that people are claiming the identity to. It is the united Israel of all 12 tribes.
Right.
And the recipient of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to Abraham's seed. So that's what was being contested within the first century.
Right. Now, I think it's important too, you mentioned briefly the exile, but I think that the exile does, as far as how the history of Israel comes into the church being part of, or being Israel, the exile features very prominently in that, because what I think a lot of people in the modern world don't realize is that northern kingdom of Israel got dispersed among the Gentiles, and the southern kingdom of Israel, or the southern kingdom of Judah, eventually comes back and is put back into the land by the Persian Empire, and then gets to stay there kind of sort of under the Roman rule. But those 12 tribes never come back. They're never brought back. And that's significant because throughout the writings of the prophets, there is a promise that the 12 tribes will be restored. And as that promise develops, it is actually a messianic prophecy that the 12 tribes will be restored through the work of the Messiah. But there's an understanding throughout the Old Testament that the 12 tribes have essentially become mixed in with the Gentile nations. So in order for them to come back, the only way this can happen is if the Gentiles get called in to the people of Israel. And this is, in fact, what the prophets predict will happen. They say that out of Judah, out of Jesse, so the tribe of Judah, and more specifically the lineage of David, there will come a shoot, and then that shoot of the tribe of, or the house of Jesse, will grow out and expand into this great tree that subsumes the whole earth under its authority. So we see, and that's just one example, there's lots of these prophecies where the Gentiles are being brought into the people of Israel. And the way that this kind of works out is throughout the Old Testament, God repeatedly has to tell the prophets, because the prophets often feel that things are pretty hopeless, because not only are the people of Israel scattered abroad, but they also are idolaters, and it does not look like they're itching to come home and be part of God's kingdom. It looks like they are just going to stay scattered abroad and worship idols and be pagan. But God says that among these people, he has preserved for himself a remnant. And this is a common theme throughout the Old Testament, is this idea that God has preserved a remnant for himself who are not idolaters, who are not worshiping idols, but actually do worship him. And so when we get to the point where Israel is being reconstituted, what we're actually claiming is that through the work of the Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ, Israel hasn't been reconstituted as a nation per se, but rather the Gentiles being called in, that remnant of Israel never fell away completely. They remained faithful, and they actually did follow the Messiah. And so all of those earliest Christians, like the apostles themselves, they were all Jews. And all of the first Christians in Antioch and Jerusalem, they were Jewish Christians. And the Romans actually perceived Christianity as a sect within Judaism because all the Christians were Jews. But as they expanded, they called the Gentiles to themselves, which is exactly what the prophets had foretold would happen. And so the Gentiles were able to become part of the remnant of Israel. So when we say that the church is Israel, we're actually making an even more specific claim, which is that the church is not just Israel itself, but the church is actually the remnant of Israel. And somebody might say, well, the Orthodox Church has a lot more people there's a lot more Orthodox Christians than Jews. So if you're saying that that's the remnant, how can the remnant be bigger than the nation? And I would just say that the remnant is bigger than the nation because it calls forth all nations. All the nations have been called into the Israel of God, and not just one nation who is, by the way, still to this day, unfortunately, in apostasy. So they're clearly not the ones that the promises are directed at. But anyway, so I went off on kind of a tangent there. I hope I didn't distract from your point there.
I actually think you summarized that nicely. So specifically, St. Paul's analysis is that the Israel of God is in fact Jesus. Israel was the name of our man, Jacob, given in a spiritual struggle, and promises were made to him. And St. Paul's analysis is that Jesus is the faithful remnant of Israel and is the proper recipient of the promises. So, in Galatians chapter 3, he makes this point that Jesus is the seed, singular, to whom the promises of Abraham were indeed promised. Christian, analysis of the covenants of promise within the Old Testament is that Jesus is the proper seed of Abraham. He is the recipient of the title of Israel. He is the promised son who was promised the kingdom forever to David when Solomon didn't really fulfill all the conditions of that promise. It was sort of like a forerunner of the promise, but really Jesus did fulfill those conditions. So this is the traditional Christian analysis of the Old Testament covenants of promise that we're calling to, and this is reinforced in Jesus' own teaching. So in Jesus' own teaching, he talks about a landowner who goes away and sends his prophets and the servants working on the farm kill them, and then he sends his son. And so Jesus is making this messianic claim that he indeed is the son of the Father who owns the land, and the land ownership indeed was our central promise within the covenant of Israel, and is why, as I said at the beginning, the Zionist state, of course, wants to identify it with Israel to reinforce its claim to ownership of that land.
Right.
So Jesus' own analysis, St. Paul's analysis, is that Jesus is the proper recipient of the promises of the covenantal inheritance. So that then leads us to the point where if Jesus is the proper recipient, then in what way do Christians participate?
Right.
And this is where we get to discussion with people who claim the Ten Commandments are binding on Christians because the church is Israel, and therefore we must be Israelites. Therefore, we ought to obey those Ten Commandments. Another analysis, the sort of Hebrew roots type people, there's a variety of different movements claiming some sort of specialness to being Hebrew or Hebraisms, who want to identify and associate themselves culturally, or identify themselves with being Hebrew, even if they're not.
Right.
Which they're mostly not. And some of them are, but most of them are not. But they see something culturally advantageous there. And so we're talking to that claim because both these groups of people implicitly have this claim that if Jesus is the Israel of promise, then joining together with him must mean that we're Israelites. And we really need to analyze that, because that isn't the logic within the New Testament. And so we've got to understand how the logic flows in the New Testament now. So that really then takes us to, I think, Leviticus 17 through 23. Because in Leviticus 17 through 23, what contemporary academics call the Holiness Code, it describes a series of laws for Israel to be holy. And interspersed within those laws are some laws that are called out to be applied to the sojourners among Israel, people living in the midst of Israel. And so a repeated phrase within those passages is so that there may be one law for the sons of Israel and for the sojourners.
Right.
And given that the whole passage, the whole 6 chapters, are discussing laws that are applicable for the sojourner as distinct from laws that are applicable for the sons of Israel, I think we need to read those statements that there be one law among you as meaning one law code,
right,
one source of laws, one set of laws. Like, the sojourners among you are not to import, a foreign set of laws.
right,
That they ought to come under the umbrella of this law code, which encompasses both the sojourner and their specific responsibilities, as distinct from the sons of Israel, who have their specific responsibilities. Some of them overlap, but not all of them. So there is a way within the Torah for people to live in the space of Israel in a way that's compatible with the holiness that Israel is expected to uphold, but not being, bound by all of Israel's specific special laws.
right.
So within St. Paul's analysis then, he explicitly rejects the idea that people need to obey the ritually distinctive aspects of Israel's laws if those people are in fact Gentiles, if they're from the nations. Now there's multiple reasons for this. The first reason is that there is explicitly a prophetic promise within Zechariah that talks to the nations flocking to Israel. Now, Kevin, you have it there in your show notes. Do you want to read that?
Yes, let me find
It's on the second to last page.
There it is. So it says, "The Lord Almighty has sent me out after glory to the nations that plundered you, and in that day many nations shall flee to the Lord for refuge, and they will be his people, and they will dwell in your midst, and you shall know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you." Zechariah 2:12 and 15.
And they'll dwell in your midst. They'll dwell in your midst. This is the key phrasing within that Holiness Code, Leviticus 17 through 23, those who live in your midst, as identifying the sojourners. So this particular prophecy is that in the Messianic age, the sign of the Messiah is that the nations will flock to Israel and sojourn with Israel. And because it explicitly says that they will live in their midst rather than become Israelites, St. Paul was of the view that telling people they needed to keep all the laws of Moses that were applicable to Israelites would be defeating this prophecy. That would run counter to the prophecy. So you can see his argumentation in Acts 15, in Galatians, and in Romans, was that people who were of the nations should not cease being of the nations, that they should flock to Israel and live in their midst, not become Israelites cultically.
Right.
So that, I think, takes us to the point of what does it take to be included in Israel as Israelites? What sort of inclusion are we talking here? What does it take to be, an Israelite? And today we have the notion of genetic descent. We have the idea of genes, of passing along genetic information. And, I don't think that this concept was, part of the analysis of the ancient peoples.
Right.
We have an idea that is kind of like partially applied in some circumstances today, this idea of identification. Now, it might be a bit dangerous bringing this idea of belonging to identify, of raising identification, because it's used in a very political set of contexts. I don't know, Kevin. Evidently, according to some people, you and I, despite our beards, could identify as women.
Right.
And be completely justified in identifying as women. But, if we were to claim to be Mexicans, that would be wrong.
Right.
We couldn't identify as Mexicans. That would be cultural appropriation and completely wrong. But, so this idea of identification is partially applied in kind of weird sort of ways.
Right.
But it is, I raise it because it is a different way of belonging, a different way of identifying. So you have, genetic descent. You find you and I are born male. We're male because we're male, right?
Right.
But some people hold that we're male simply because we identify as male.
Right.
Which is a different criteria. But turns out that in the ancient world, they too had a different criteria for belonging.
Right.
And that criteria is something we can probably term something like ritual inclusion. So if you participate in the rituals of Israel, then you were Israelite. Then you can claim the heritage from the from the patriarchs. And so, ritual inclusion included circumcision. It included sacrifices at the temple, kosher food laws, Sabbath rest, and these items were the means through which, and of course, participating in the Paschal sacrifice.
Right.
Absolutely key. If you were circumcised, or if you were circumcised and kept the food laws and kept the Sabbath rest and the Paschal, offering each year, you had indeed joined Israel.
Right.
In fact, interestingly, I was often told that the mixed multitude of Egyptians and other people who came out with the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from the Exodus, I was often told that these people were just destroyed within the 40 years of wilderness wandering. But when I actually look up Jewish tradition, they actually tell a different story.
Right.
They actually say that these people actually joined and became Israel through ritual inclusion and intermarrying among the tribes. So they became part of Israel's covenant, their worshiping community, through inclusion in the specific, and St. Paul's terms for it is works of the law, the specific items of identity that come to define what it means to be an Israelite. And they became part of the clan structure through intermarriage with the clans.
Right.
So, in the first century, there's a bunch of Roman diatribes against Hebraizing Romans or Greeks, or
Right.
Hebraizing Gentiles. They'd make fun of them. They'd say things like, in the first generation, the man turns up to synagogue and recites psalms. In the second generation, the son keeps Sabbath. In the third Sabbath and food laws. In the third generation, they get circumcised and become fully a Jew. And I don't think we do any different today. People like to identify distinctions between people, and this was talking about the fact that across multiple generations, there was a way to be included within Judah, within the worshipping community of Judah, to become Judean, associating themselves with that identity through ritual inclusion that typically occurred across multiple generations.
Right.
So this was a thing that was commonplace in the first century, and plenty of Roman writers identified it even pejoratively.
Right.
And so when these Pharisees from Jerusalem turned up to Antioch and said to the Gentiles who had, by ritual inclusion through baptism and participating in the communion, who by ritual participation had been included within the Christian worshipping community, they turned up and said, you have to keep all the laws of Moses, circumcision, and all the other laws in order to be saved. You can't be properly a Christian unless you keep all these laws. St. Paul was dead against that because of the reason we've talked about, because of the prophecy in Zechariah, but also another reason that he rolls out in both Galatians and Romans, where he says that it is Christ who has established covenantal righteousness. He is the circumcised son. He is the inheritor of the promises. He is the basis. Christ is the basis on which your covenantal righteousness is established. And so if people are saying, oh no, I'm not sure whether that's enough, I need to be circumcised myself, I need to do the food laws, I need to adopt the entire identity. St. Paul is against that for Gentiles because that is tantamount to saying, I'm not convinced of Christ's righteousness. I'm not convinced of his covenantal identity. I need myself to establish my own righteousness apart from Christ. And St. Paul says that would be deleterious to their faith, that would detract from the claim that Christ is that inheritor of the promises, that he is that covenantally righteous person. And if you think about it, participating in Pascha is a household law.
Right.
The head of the household needs to be a member of the covenant community, being circumcised. The women and the children, are included within that household, without, there's no female circumcision. There's nothing on the female side. So essentially, symbolically, that inclusion on the female side of things is symbolically who Christians are identified as, because it is Christ who has established his covenantal righteousness, and inclusion within the worshipping household of God is by being ritually united with him, ritually included within the worshipping community within that household, therefore partaking of the paschal sacrifice because of Christ's righteousness, because you're a part of that household. And so that's why the church is referred to as a bride, as a woman.
Right.
And interestingly, if you follow that logic through, the people who say we need to keep those laws, whether it's the Ten Commandments or all of the Torah laws, because we're Israelites, don't follow the same logic through in terms of the symbolic representation of the church as a woman. They don't say, oh, because we join an entity that is identified in gender terms as a female, that we're all females. They don't make that claim. So, to be consistent, one oughtn't make one claim without the other, because it's the same sort of thing. So by being a Christian united with Christ through baptism does not make us an Israelite per se. It means that we're living in the midst of Israel, living within the household of Christ, experiencing the paschal sacrifice because of the righteousness of Christ, and thus the church, St. Paul says in Galatians 6, is the Israel of God without all of its constituent members being Israelites.
Right. Right. We're the wild olive tree that's been grafted in to the natural olive tree in Romans 11.
Yes, there's many different ways of expressing and symbolically representing what we're saying here. So when we talked about the laws and the meaning of laws in last session, and we went into it in great depth. So I think rather than talking about laws and the meaning of law and what law is and so forth,
Right.
we can just say see last session, because we talked about it in depth. It was a pretty long one, and but what we were dealing with just today is, ought we? What is the argument? Ought we obey a certain specific set of laws from the Torah because the New Testament identifies the church as Israel, we've joined the church, therefore we ought to obey those laws? Well, no, that logic doesn't follow and doesn't flow. But even more than that, I think there is something else to be said, and that is that people, often when they're reading Jeremiah 31:31, imagine that the laws that God is going to place in your heart is, the laws of the Ten Commandments, for example.
Right.
But going back to our very first episode, where we talked about the fact that receiving God's words in the form of law was a distancing of Israel from God, when God said, "Hear my voice," and they said, "No, we don't want to hear your voice, we want to hear Moses' voice." Actually, these laws and seeing the law code as being what is most important is actually something that is, of secondary importance, or it is something that is lesser than hearing God's voice, which Abraham was praised for, and Moses was praised for, and David was praised for, and everyone who was faithful is praised for hearing God's voice.
Right.
Within Christianity, not only do we have the opportunity to hear God's voice, we have the opportunity to see God in the person of Jesus. He is the representable image of the invisible God. And so we see not only in the New Testament covenant a hearing of God's voice, but a seeing, a visual representation, having been manifest in the flesh. So this is a greater reception of godliness than what was available within the covenant at Sinai. And because there is a greater reception, there is a different type of law that is placed within our hearts. Whilst we can profitably meditate on all the Torah, what is the law that is placed in a Christian's heart is in fact the law of the Spirit. And in Romans, we have St. Paul meditating on the law of the Spirit and saying that if the Spirit is within you, then you are adopted as sons. receive the adoption of sonship, which, by the way, the adoption of sonship is absolutely open to women as well as men.
Right.
Women are considered within the New Testament writings to be sons of Christ.
Right.
Why? Because sons have full inheritance rights. Women have just as much of inheritance rights as men, and the language, the gendered language within the New Testament was to assure all women that they have equal inheritance rights along with the menfolk. So, by the way, that's why when we get translations of scripture that hide all those genderedness,
Right.
it actually works in the opposite way. It actually gets rid of some of the best promises, some of the best gender neutral promises, by hiding what the Bible's actually saying.
Right, exactly.
So translators, don't do that.
Right.
Don't do that. Let's just have better biblical literacy.
Exactly. Exactly.
And so there is a reception of law, and it's like the Holy Spirit is like receiving the law of gravity, except he's light and life and love and spirit and fire in your veins. So, certainly receiving a text in which laws are written down, that is one thing.
Right.
But opening oneself to hearing God's voice, to meditating on those laws, to having a spirit-led living of those laws is something else entirely. And that is the law that Christians are called to.
Right. Definitely. So one thing that I would ask, maybe as kind of a little bit of a follow-up question, is, and this isn't in our show notes, so forgive me if I'm throwing you a curveball, but for example, in the Ethiopian tradition, they tend to retain a lot of the Old Testament law that the rest of Orthodoxy doesn't. And the reason they give for that is that, excuse me, they don't require it of Gentile converts, but that most of the early Ethiopian church were all Jews. And so they continued with a lot of the ritualistic practices of Israel because they were Jews. So it would seem that the logic of what we've said about you and I being those who have come out from the nations and dwell in the remnant people of Israel, it's a little bit different if you're a Jew and you come to be a part of the remnant people of Israel, which is the church. Because there's one church, there's not a Jewish church and a Gentile church, it's all one. So if someone comes from the religion of Judaism and converts to the true Israel of Christianity, would you suggest that they keep the laws of the Israelites, or would you suggest that they live more in the way that other Christians do?
You said it wasn't in the show notes, but I had a sneaking suspicion you'd ask this question regardless. Okay, so here's my answer that is not an answer. I'm gonna punt this one, and I'll punt some people in a very specific direction, because Father Stephen DeYoung was recently spent a few hours involved in a study of the Hebrew Bible and discussions with someone whose name was just escaping me. Jacob, I think it's Jacob Facciarelli. I think that's his name.
Mm-hmm.
Jacob Facciarelli's. I hope I got that name right. Anyway, you can put it in the show notes and the links to the episode I'm talking about. Father Stephen DeYoung got involved in a Bible study with Jacob and a few of Jacob's friends, and spent a good deal of time, teasing that exact question and thinking through it and what it means. I'm keen on, explaining the logic that is in Scripture.
Right.
I'm not keen on speculating, sort of beyond it with those sorts of questions.
Okay.
But Father Stephen DeYoung did engage in some speculation around it and sketched out some possibilities. And so I'd point you in that direction to go and listen to that if that question really intrigues you, to listen to his answer.
Okay, sounds good. I accept that answer. To be honest with you, it's not a question that really affects me at all. But just other than as a person who has a heart to see people of all the nations, including those who schismed off from us right away when the church was very new, the people who were not part of the remnant of Israel, but were part of the chosen nation, but not the remnant within it, and their descendants. St. Paul had a heart for the Jews, that they would be brought to repentance and come into the fullness of the faith. And so in that sense, it's a question that interests me because, like St. Paul, I would love to see the Jews brought into the faith. But to be honest, I live in a town where there might be like 600 Jews total. So, the likelihood that I actually run into a Jew and get to share the gospel with them is honestly fairly low. So it's not a question that affects me too terribly much. But
well, maybe we might have some listening right now.
That's true. We might. So, yeah. So if you are a Jew and you're listening and that question interests you, then go listen to the podcast that Loryn just teased. And all that I would say and this I think Loryn and I can say with certainty, is that the church is the Israel of God, and Jesus is your Messiah. He was your Messiah before he was our Messiah. And so, we just would love to see you come into the joy of knowing the true God through the true Messiah, who belongs to your people by right. And we're the wild olive branch that's been grafted in, but you belong on the olive branch. So by all means, come and check out the Orthodox Church and see what our divine liturgy is like, and see what it is to experience the true worship of the God of Israel among the true remnant of his people. So that's what I would say to any Jews who are listening.
Well, thank you. Look, I think we've paid back our listeners in kind. Last time was a long time, and this is shorter than our average because
right.
we're happy to build on previous episodes that we'd laid down. So on average, guys, I think we've done about 90 minutes a session. So I hope they forgive us for the extremely long one last time. If we jump off now, we'll we'll average out at a reasonable length of time.
Sure thing. Sounds good to me. Well, thank you so much, Loryn, for joining us. And thank you for watching. Please do share this with your friends, especially any friends of yours who are maybe Seventh-day Adventist or Hebrew roots or have some other, or a Zionist kind of dispensationalist or anything like that, so that they too can be freed indeed. God bless.